Welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through today's topic. We're going to be exploring the centuries-old concept that, surprisingly enough, is basically a tailor-made antidote to our modern exhaustion. We're talking about the Sabbath mandate. Now, whether you're a history buff or just someone who literally feels bone-tired at the end of a long week, there is something incredibly fascinating for you here. So, here's a question for you. Why has simply taking a day off been a massive source of controversy, debate, and even conflict for thousands of years? I mean, it sounds completely counterintuitive, right? Taking a break should just be universally celebrated. But as we're about to see, it's anything but simple. In this explainer, we're going to trace the chronological evolution of rest, all the way from ancient law straight through to today's relentless hustle culture. And we're going to uncover exactly why taking a breather has always been such a battle.
Okay, let's dive into this. Part 1. The original rest mandate.
The foundational text for this whole concept sits right in the book of Exodus. It says, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work." Now, according to these ancient texts, the Lord established this mandate because He created the heavens, the earth, the sea, the whole shebang in 6 days, and then He rested on the seventh. By doing that, He blessed the seventh day and made it holy. It set up this divine rhythm, work, then stop. Sounds simple enough, but the actual application, well, that's where things get absolutely groundbreaking.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer scope of who this mandate covers. It doesn't just apply to you, like the landowner or the boss. Oh no, it applies to your son, your daughter. It applies to your male or female servant. It literally even applies to your animals and any foreigner residing in your towns. In the context of the ancient world, this was a radical, wildly inclusive concept. It was a mandated pause that completely leveled the playing field, granting equality and a mandatory break to absolutely everyone, right down to the working animals. It was just this beautiful, universal gift of rest.
Which brings us to Part 2, breaking the ancient rule. If we trace the historical decay of the Sabbath across the eras of the prophets, a pretty clear pattern starts to emerge. We start back in the 13th century BC with Exodus, that original pure command we were just looking at. But man, jump forward to the 8th century BC with the prophets Isaiah and Amos, and suddenly we're seeing meaningless offerings and intense commercial greed taking over. By the time we hit the 5th century BC with Nehemiah, people are just completely ignoring the rest mandate. They're out there treading winepresses and hauling agricultural loads. That whole concept of a universal day of rest was rapidly disintegrating.
And this quote from Isaiah really hits the nail on the head regarding the divine perspective. It says, "Stop bringing meaningless offerings. Your incense is detestable to me. New moons, Sabbaths, and convocations, I cannot bear your worthless assemblies." You see, God's original intention of pure, restorative rest and connection was totally lost. Sure, the people were still holding these religious gatherings, but they were corrupted, they were hypocritical. The text shows God viewing these empty rituals as completely detestable because, well, the heart behind them was just entirely wrong. If we look at these specific grievances recorded by Nehemiah over in Judah, it paints a super clear picture. People were literally treading wine presses on the Sabbath. They were loading up donkeys with grain, wine, and fruit, dragging massive loads into Jerusalem, and aggressively selling food on the day of rest. Now think about this in our modern context for a second. How different is treading a wine press on your day off from, say, opening your laptop to fire off a batch of work emails on a Sunday morning? It's the exact same human impulse. We prioritize commerce, productivity, and just getting ahead, completely over our essential need to stop and rest. And the prophet Amos actually diagnosed the root cause of this brilliantly. He exposed what we might call the greedy mindset. The text described people impatiently waiting, basically tapping their feet for the Sabbath to end, saying, "When will the Sabbath be ended that we may market wheat?" And they weren't just eager to get back to work, they were eager to skimp on the measure, boost the prices, and cheat people with dishonest scales. They deeply resented this mandated rest simply because it pressed pause on their endless pursuit of profit.
Let's move to Part 3, flipping the script, and see how this builds when Jesus arrives on the scene.
Right away in the 1st century, we see this profound clash of perspectives. On one side, you have the Pharisees' legalism. They are incredibly rigid. The texts say they watched Jesus closely just to find a reason to accuse him, literally saying, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." For them, the rule was way more important than the person. But then, juxtapose that against Jesus' heart of grace. He says, "How much more valuable is a person than a sheep?" Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. He's flipping the script, shifting the focus entirely back to prioritizing human life and healing over strict legalistic rule following. Which leads to one of the most powerful questions recorded in the text. Jesus looks directly at the religious leaders and asks, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? Now, I want you to feel the weight of that pause. The text actually notes that in the face of this profound moral challenge, the Pharisees remained completely silent. They had absolutely no answer. Why? Because their obsession with the rule had totally blinded them to the actual purpose of the rule.
And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate philosophical pivot found in Mark 2:27. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Just think about how incredibly liberating that statement is. Rest was designed as a gift to serve humanity, to rejuvenate us. We weren't created just to be slaves to some rigid, burdensome calendar requirement. Jesus essentially reclaimed the Sabbath as a vital tool for human flourishing.
Which brings us to part 4, the ongoing Sabbath debate.
Now, despite all of that, the early church continued to really struggle with this rule. Acts points out the massive irony that the rulers of Jerusalem actually fulfilled prophetic words by condemning Jesus. The very prophetic words they rigorously read every single Sabbath. It's crazy. Later on, the Apostle Paul had to actively warn the early communities. He explicitly writes to the Colossians, "Do not let anyone judge you with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day." He even expressed genuine fear to the Galatians that his efforts were completely wasted on them because they were falling backward into these legalistic traps, obsessing over calendar observances and constantly judging each other over them.
And finally, part 5, escaping modern hustle culture.
So why does all this ancient history matter to us right now? Well, because our fundamental human struggle with rest hasn't changed one bit. Just look at the symptoms of our modern era. Embracing hustle culture, trying to literally outwork your exhaustion, ignoring your basic need for rest and reflection, overworking yourself to the absolute point of burnout, tying your entire worth as a human being to your daily productivity, feeling way too guilty to ever just slow down. So the crucial point is, we are doing the exact same thing the ancients did in Judah. We are trading a divine gift of peace for a relentless soul-crushing pursuit of more. We've essentially become our own legalistic taskmasters.
If you find yourself constantly tying your worth to your output, these ancient sources offer a pretty provocative challenge. Go to church anyway, or simply step away from the modern winepress. Pause the hustle and just accept the gift of rest. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought. In our relentless pursuit of more, what are you willing to stop doing this week to reclaim your own humanity? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.